Dr. Harry Thompson of the Center for Western Studies was one of the driving forces behind this book. In fact, I think for a lot of the history of this book, he was the driving force behind it. He gets all the credit for the cover. So if you can judge a book by its cover, and you like the cover, give that credit to Dr. Harry Thompson, who chose the cover. And also, thanks to all of the contributing authors who could not be here this evening. They number more than the authors who are here this evening. I will thank the authors who are here this evening, but I also have to extend thanks to those who couldn't make it. They were just as instrumental in contributing to this book. And I want to thank each of the contributors who ventured to Marshall, Minnesota personally this evening. Lisa Ocean, Bill Hoffman, and Dennis Anderson. I knew you prior to this event and prior to this project, and I was so impressed with what you did. I wanted you on board, and I managed to get you on board, and I thank you for coming on board, because I know it wasn't necessarily often the easiest of processes. And I'm going to introduce each of these people on the panel right here, and together we'll say a few words about the book, and then each person will want to say some separate words about his or her contribution to the book, and then the audience can join in with questions. Our first author is Lisa Ocean of Des Moines Area Community College. She has a PhD in agricultural history from Iowa State University. She is the author of 3 books on topics ranging from the Great Depression to growing up during World War II. She is working on a 4th book, but for now, her most recent publication is the essay that she contributed to Conservation on the Northern Plains, which is aptly titled Too Much and Too Little. It's one of the lead essays in conservation on the Northern Plains. So thank you again for coming up from Iowa for this event. Our second author is Dennis Anderson. He's on the far end of the table. Many of you know him as the outdoors columnist for the Star Tribune. Prior to this, he was at the Pioneer Press, the rival newspaper. And he is also one of the originators of Ducks Unlimited. He wrote the preface to Conservation on the Northern Plains and found time with his many other writing projects for the Star Tribune to pen some words that help put the book into context. And our third author is William Hoffman of the University of Minnesota. He is author of the acclaimed book, The Biologist's Imagination. He is the author of the first essay in the book on Redwood County native and ecology pioneer Raymond Lindeman, as though anyone from Redwood County could ever do something so important. But more than anyone, Raymond Lindeman is the father of contemporary ecology. And I was so pleased to have someone do a biography of Raymond Lindeman for the book. And so, without my saying a lot of words, I'd like to give the authors some opportunities to say their words, give presentations, and then we'll come back to some questions I have for the authors. And then also I want to invite the audience to ask questions and offer comments during the discussion period. So I think that you're up first. So you have the screen, or do you want to go live? Oh, okay, all right.
That way I'll just, whatever time is available, I'll make it work.
Yes.
If you don't mind, I'd like to stand.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Because I'm going to read a few passages from the chapter. I was very pleased to be asked by Professor Amato to contribute to this book. I am not a historian, although I was an undergraduate history major, but I've worked in medical school for a long time, University of Minnesota, more than 30 years, and I have diverse interests. And when it was suggested that I consider writing a chapter, I knew there was someone at the U of M, long ago, I'd seen a documentary on TV, who was really important in ecology. I couldn't remember who it was, and I had to actually do some digging before I finally found that it was Raymond Lindeman from southwestern Minnesota, Redwood County, which is right over here. But I didn't feel quite so bad after I shared my chapter with a past president of the University of Minnesota who I've stayed in contact with, and he said, Raymond Lindeman, this is great, I really enjoyed reading it, but I've never heard of it. President of the University of Minnesota. He's on the wall of scholars, the Scholars Walk at the U dedicated to University of Minnesota greats. The Wall of Discovery, his work is represented there. So I dug into it, and I was just fascinated that this farm boy from Redwood County would have such stature in the scientific community. Partly because he died at age 27, so he died as a postdoc when he was at Yale University after having completed his degree, his PhD in zoology at the university in 1941. Died in 1942 at age 27 of a severe liver disease. He published one paper, and that paper, according to Frank Edgerton, who's considered the leading historian of ecology, is the greatest ecological paper ever published, 1942. And I start my account of Raymond Lindeman in this fashion. Under the summer sun of the late 1930s, as the world emerged from economic depression and reeled toward war, a graduate student would inflate his pneumatic boat and set out on a small lake in east central Minnesota to gather samples for ecological studies. One of his academic advisors at the University of Minnesota had spotted the lake during a reconnaissance flight years earlier and regarded it as a good subject for research. The student, Ray Lindeman, went about his sample collecting beneath the source of the energy that animated the ecological system of the bog-like lake. He sought to understand in bold and original detail. About the same time, a Cornell University nuclear physicist, a Jewish emigre from Nazi Germany, was trying to solve the mystery of that very energy source, the sun, and solve it he did, publishing the energy production in stars in the months before the sun set on Europe with the outbreak of war. Both the graduate student and the physicist were theoretical systems thinkers by nature. Both used thermodynamic calculations. Both were interested in energy flow, one through ecosystems and the other through stars. They had something else in common. The graduate student, naturally enough, got his hands and feet dirty doing his work. The students of physicist Hans Bethe couldn't help but notice his muddy shoes when he came to class. Hans Bethe, of course, was a very, very famous physicist who fled Nazi Germany in the 30s and taught at Cornell. He was a key member of the Manhattan Project. I basically looked to see, when I learned that Ray Lindeman's key contribution to ecological science was how energy flows through food webs. You think about ecology, you think about the relationship of organisms in a given space in the environment. And the ecology, since its beginning in the late 19th century, up to that time, for 50 years of ecology, had focused on the relationship of the organisms and was almost totally aligned with the biological sciences. It was Lindeman's contribution to realize that energy was key to the functioning of what he called the ecosystem. He didn't coin the word ecosystem. A British botanist in 1936, when Lindeman was out on the lake, he coined the word ecosystem and argued that that we can't just consider biological science, but we have to consider physical science. We have to consider inorganic molecules as well as carbon, essentially. If you're going to think about how it all works together. So what Lindeman did is take the concept of ecosystem that Tansley introduced and basically put empirical data to work there by studying this bog lake north of Minneapolis in a very unusual geological area called the Anoka Sand Plain for over 5 years, collecting data. And he basically introduced the idea that how energy is used throughout the food web in a given environment like that. This is becoming hugely important today in the era of ecological footprints, as you can see, which is also very closely tied with conservation. Conservation we traditionally thought of as, protecting the soil, protecting crops from pests, protecting wetlands and so on. But now we have to keep in mind how this all works as a system, and how human influence can alter the balance in the system to the detriment of its long-term usefulness for sure, but its long-term function in general. So I'm going to finish by there's a lot in here, by quoting at the end of the last paragraph here. And the name of the reserve is called the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, just north of Minneapolis. And it is world famous for understanding how ecosystems function. The Cedar Creek upland forest wetland mosaic the Lindeman came to know stretches across the heart of the Anoka sandplain. The ecological succession of the bog lake he explored proceeds largely as nature would have it proceed. In contrast, the prairie wetland mosaic of Redwood County at the time of Thoreau's visit, Henry David Thoreau visit in 1861, has been transformed into a food production grid. Like much of Earth, southwestern Minnesota no longer possesses a natural history unaltered by human design. But it produced Lindeman just as the wetlands preservation movement was beginning to flower on the prairie. It gave the world a keen intelligence for imagining and describing the life-energy dynamic of an aquatic system, an ecosystem's dynamic animated by energy from the sun.
It sounds even better when you read it than I read it over and over again, and I hear your voice read that.
That's what our title.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he found it. I was happy with it.
Okay, I'm Dennis Anderson, and I was asked by Tony, I know your dad or both, I don't know, I got a lot of notes with the same last name, to write the introduction to the book. And so for better or worse, I write a lot, and so when people call me and say, would you like to write some more, generally speaking, I say no. I have enough. But I have great respect for Tony and his dad both, and have quoted them previously and had them enlighten me at various times. About probably 10 years ago, I don't know, time goes by so fast, you might as well just forget it. Really. I wrote a series of stories in the Star Tribune, I think over 5 days. It was basically, I think it was called The State of the State. And the idea was to look at talking about Bill here, the system of how changes have come to the state, therefore the land, therefore the people causing them, and kind of comes full circle then being the butt of those changes as well. So I started out as a history of people coming here, the draining occurring starting in the southwest part of the state and southern part of the state. I mean, tremendous drainage. If you've ever looked at those old maps of southern Minnesota, I mean, it was just pockmarked with water. And read the old diaries of the surveyors before the land could be actually conveyed to the state. It was a territory from the federal government, it had to be surveyed. And the surveys would walk through those swamps or marshes, really. And then at night, because they were out there, they would build platforms to get up over the mosquitoes and then just sleep there and then, continue their work the next day. So if you can imagine your work and that work. But of course the drainage came, and then the railroads came, and so that they could settle it, they had to have rail lines so you could get the crops to market in Minneapolis. And then one of my interests, of course, is the sports came, the hunters came, the Bell Museum, of course, named after James Ford Bell, And James Ford Bell was a great duck hunter, and I don't know if he was a great duck hunter, but he was very interested duck hunter. And he used to, if you look in the old, even in the old Star Tribune files, he and his wealthy, everybody wore suits then, but his compatriots on Fridays would stand on the train platform in downtown Minneapolis with their dog crates, wooden dog crates. They'd wait for the train, and the train would take them to Heron Lake, and they'd arrive about 2:30 in the morning, and their guides would pick them up, and then they would go and they would have a few drinks. They wouldn't go to sleep because dawn was coming, and then they'd shoot, and that would be Saturday morning. They'd shoot Sunday morning, get on the train, and come back. So, there was that period of Minnesota history, and then the rural kind of expansion and explosion of people, relative explosion of people. And then beginning in the 50s, and a lot of things happened where the rural collapse began for a lot of different reasons. Media, of course, helped that. It used to be when people grew up on a farm here and they had 40 acres or 160 acres, whatever it was, your mindset when you grew up was confined by that land space. And you were, essentially defining yourself, your family, and your future by those, the perimeter of that. Well, when media came, radio first and then television, and they turned it on, and they could begin to see there was stuff out there. And that was one of the actual propellants that caused people to start thinking, and then of course the economy of stores. And so people moved, and we had the rapid urbanization of the Twin Cities. And all of this ultimately contributed to a decline of water quality, the same challenges we face today. And then when they were done doing it to the Twin Cities, and people had some money, especially in the 90s, and things were cooking, they started buying all that land up by Brainerd and building their mansions up there on the lakes and so forth. So, it really, and the idea, back to how I first met Tony and his dad, I was doing some reading. And you may not remember this, but that concept, I was reading some papers that they wrote, and the concept that we as people claim to be doing one thing and acting in one way, particularly about how much we love nature, or how much we're trying to conserve or do the right thing by nature, and how we exemplify that to ourselves, try to reinforce it. We might drive, I was using an example talking to Bill earlier, drive a Jeep, I've got a Jeep, and I've got a picture of some ducks and pheasants on the wall, and I've got a flannel shirt on, but at the same time, all of us are part of this massive machine that's really actually eating up those resources and using them in many different ways, not all of them good. And that whole notion of cognitive dissonance, of the disparity between those two, was fascinating to me, and I could see it interwoven in Minnesota's history. And so when I was asked to write the foreword of this, I was trying to think, these guys who contributed are actual academics with footnotes, and the footnote part was going to be out of mine. And but I wanted to, figure out some way of, at least the goal being evocative in a way, in a personal way that says, okay, how did this person end up where this person is? And though I try to recount my personal history, I was born in North Dakota and lived there until about, I was in 6th grade, I think we moved. My dad was in the grocery business, and he had a number of grocery stores out there, and then sold them and we moved to Michigan. But my grandparents lived in Frazee up by Detroit Lake, so in summers we spent a lot of time up there. All of this, when I came back to go to school in Morris, which was a real awakening to me, because I didn't, there are tractors on the Main Street there regularly. And it's a lot like Marshall in a lot of ways. They played basketball there, we'd come down here as Towntonian, and really this whole country was new to me again as a 19-year-old or so, and I just grew to respect it so much. Obviously I loved it, but I respected it so much. I loved the landscape. I loved in the fall the migration of birds, which was greater at that time than it is now, and pheasants as well, and the people as well. And, this was the kind of thing where I started to think over time, did the people here make this land? I mean, what it was? I mean, did they make the land? Does the land make these people over generations? And I wrote about that and kind of tried to set that up. I'll read a little bit as well here if I can find it. Okay. So I talk about this a little bit where I came back and went to school in Morris. Add to this my college years spent in west central Minnesota in Morris with its prairie heritage, and it's fair to say my interest in writings bore a sort of bipolar focus back because I'd grown up in Upper Peninsula, Michigan, where there's woods. Fascinated equally and often simultaneously with grasslands and forests and the flora and fauna that flourished in each. So it was in my travels and writings that I regularly immersed myself in southern Minnesota marshes as well as the prairie pothole region of the Dakotas, and also the watery canoe country that divides Minnesota and Ontario. Each to me was comforting and an inspiration. But even more fascinating were the people who lived in and among these terrains. When I lived in Ely, when I got out of college and eventually went to grad school and then left, I moved to Ely. I always wanted, well, it's cool. I've always gone on canoe trips up there. And this was in 1977. And the Boundary Waters whole controversy was firing up again. And through my editing of the newspaper there, one of two in a town of 3,000, also had a separately owned shopper and a separately owned radio station. We were all going broke, but we were having fun. And so I became a friend of Cedar who was still alive then. And he was a real inspiration to me. What I had done is I made the mistake of reprinting one of his stories in the paper, not really fully understanding that he was hated in his hometown for being a wilderness advocate, and most everybody else was for mining and so forth. So we printed that, we also, my buddy and I, we also delivered the paper, not to homes, but the stands in town. And so we did that, and I came back to our dumpy little office, and I was sitting there, and people just paraded in and started berating me, and so Cedar kind of befriended me in that, and I became very close to him in the years I was there and thereafter. And he represented this as well. He was a person of the north. He moved to Ely. The land, as it does up there, as it does here, captivated him. He became part of the movement to, quote unquote, save and preserve that land. And so that interaction of people and then land back to people in multiple generations. So I say, but even more fascinating were the people who lived in and among these terrains. To what degree, I often ask myself, had they been shaped by the land and water that surrounded them? And how had they in turn shaped these same resources, either by exploiting them, conserving them, or both? Intriguing as well was the variation in conservation interests I found among these inhabitants. Some were deeply engrossed in ensuring or attempting to ensure that clean waters and healthy lands were passed down to future generations, while others were altogether apathetic about these responsibilities. And just to close, you see that right now in the legislature. I'm sure you're aware, to some degree anyway, that this legislature is brutal so far. It hasn't ended yet, but it's going to end in a couple of weeks, one way or the other. And in terms of dismantling environmental regulations, in terms of taking money, that legacy money that most of you probably voted for in 2008, and rerouting that to different uses than was intended. Kind of the list goes on and on. It's really freewheeling. And again, those questions, when I talk to people who are legislators, and I got named them, there are not too many from here actually leading that charge. Fabian's, Rosso, and the other two guys are from the Northwest as well, who are just totally indifferent. You can talk to them and say, well, what do you think about clean water? What do you think about these soils that can't take? The potato farmers are really pushing the potato industry in that sands country up north of St. Cloud and by Park Rapids are really pushing to get those aquifers and access to those aquifers for irrigation that they need. What do you think about that? And it's a total blank. And I long ago gave up assigning malice to that. Some people just don't get it. Some people just don't get it. And in the end, as I mentioned here, that to me, it's really the crux of the human condition. And especially as you kind of look forward. Years ago, in 1988, I spent a whole year trying to determine why North American ducks had declined by 60% since 1940. I was a big duck hunter. My dad was a duck hunter. I love ducks. I don't have to shoot them. I love to watch them, and particularly the way they move, the many different species, the colorings, the feathering. So my first trip was down to Louisiana, where the rumors were rife over the years that they poached and killed a lot of ducks down on the Gulf Coast. And I befriended a federal agent down there who really got me into some good situations, good reporting situations, and met a lot of fascinating people. And really, in the end, Louisiana people, the Cajuns down there who shot so many ducks, were doing it as a culture, as part of their history. And I could appreciate that to a much greater degree than over in Texas, where they were sports from Houston and Dallas, where they just shot for fun. But in any event, one morning, we were out in the marsh in the bayou, and imagine how long and wide those marshes are. 250 miles from Texas to Mississippi, up to 60 miles deep. Okay, and they were forced to patrol that in pirogues, or what are canoes, the two federal agents that were there, because a helicopter they had crashed, and the political apparatus made sure they didn't get another one because it was too effective. Footnote zoom ahead, as you might recall, Minnesotans, after I wrote those stories, bought them a new helicopter. We bought the federal government helicopter for $650,000. Didn't make sense, but it was the only way they were going to get one. Anyway, we were in the marsh, and the guys from the air in the airplane had spotted that these blinds were baited, and with corn, that's why the ducks would come in. Even if you shot, the ducks just kept coming, and they could shoot as many as you want. So these three agents and I paddled these wooden pirogues out there at 1 in the morning, sat there slapping chiggers, and hopefully no water moccasins. And waited, the guy came out, and his party, and they had two blinds, and they shot 79 ducks before the agents presented themselves and stopped. They always let them shoot a lot, because before they went before the judge, they wanted to say, and they didn't want them saying we're only 2 or 3 ducks old. So they paddled out, showed their badges, and my friend Dave Hall, federal agent, had this program called Poachers to Preachers. And he had this big video camera, and he would video the bust, interview the guys who were being busted, and then later when they're convicted, turn them into hopefully good guys as part of their sentence, and they would have to go to school and so forth and say, this isn't a good thing, don't do this. So this particular guy and his kids, teenage kids, the guy had been busted, this was his 3rd time. So Dave Hall said to him, and he said, hey, you hold, so I'm holding the camera, right? And so now I'm part of the problem. So I'm holding the camera, and Dave's saying, all right, we busted you 3 times now. And now you've got your kids out here, you killed 80-some ducks, and what's it going to take for you to come out in the marsh, beautiful morning like this, shoot a limit of ducks and stop when you shoot a limit of ducks? And this guy's name was Jesse Dewey, I'll never forget it. And so this guy, and to his credit, I'm still looking at this camera, right? To his credit, he thinks about it for a while. There's a pause, I thought he would just blow him off or smart off. He thinks about it, and raise the limit. And I thought about that, and really that's what we do. We raise a limit. We raise a limit of what we'll accept. If we lose some woods, we expand corn and soybeans to stretch the limits of what the land can accept, and we just try it again. The water is a little spoiled, and wells in Lyon County, well, they're not so bad in Blue Earth County. And it's an interesting part of the human condition, and my contribution to this book in that respect is minimal, but these 2 people and the others did a great job, and if you have a chance, I would suggest you read it. Thank you.
So Tony took us out to eat at a Chinese restaurant beforehand, and this was seriously my fortune cookie. You are contemplative and analytic by nature. So, talking of nature, not by nature, okay? And I must confess, I just turned in grades yesterday, so I've been dealing with 2 weeks of up-teen millennial angst. Okay, so it doesn't look to be too much in this room, so this is lovely. I did my dissertation on Iowa during the Second World War by the suggestion of my major professor. And one of the 4 areas that I looked at was the farm front of Iowa. And Iowa is almost 94% farms. It is the most ecologically altered state in the country. And people don't know that. And there are all sorts of things, you know, and you have to kind of ask yourself, why have we had 2 500-year floods in 10 years, right? Like, things don't add up. And so as a historian, you know, how have things come to be as they are? This is what another major professor of mine would say. And so when I looked at the farm front, what happens is with the war, okay, farming has to take a completely different direction. It has to be all-out production, moving to complete hybridization, mechanization, because you've lost all the young men in that. And so it got to the point by the end of the war, they were saying, if you were doing any soil conservation efforts, you were aiding Hitler. Like, this was the end of the argument. It had to move forward, okay, in that kind of direction. So the war would change everything about agriculture and about our perceptions of conservation then. So then I went back and I did another book looking at, well, so what happened before the Second World War, before the New Deal? What was Iowa like at that time? And if you see, too, this is when Herbert Hoover, our only Iowa-born president, is coming into office at this time. And probably, I think it's pretty safe to say, next to Theodore Roosevelt, Herbert Hoover was the biggest outdoorsman. Okay? I mean, he advised every president to go fishing, because it was the only time you could be somewhat alone and think. So perhaps that's maybe advice for our current president, I don't know. But if you'll advance, Nellie. So what I wanted to just kind of talk about today, because I once gave a talk about the Second World War, about my book, and a very wise 90-year-old woman said, well, you told me so much about the book, I don't need to buy it now. So, so I'm not going to tell you that much about the book part, okay, because Tony wants you to buy it, and it's very good. But anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about that. So Phil, turn it. Okay. So this is the beginnings of the Depression era. And so when we look at conservation, it is such a mix of politics and recreation, social issues, religious issues, and you name it. I mean, it's just all of these things coming together. Okay? So what I looked at 1933. 1933 is the depths of the Depression. Yet it's also the height of the family farm. And so that's what, so if we use that image, in 1933, we had more people in Iowa farming on the land. Okay, we actually had a farm vote. But it's also at that height, it's also the tucking under and the sweeping away. And so now today in Iowa, we have less than 3%, okay, who are farming the land. So we have different connections to land, but we have very few people. There is no longer a farm vote, okay, because we just simply don't have other people. So we kind of think of that image. And so I don't have too much time. I'm just going to kind of go through just a little bit of some photos to have you thinking about this, because conservation is such a complicated topic. But losing the horses. Farmers had said during the Depression era, when the horses go, there's going to be something lost, okay, with that. And it's not only going to give us more business aspect, but we're going to lose that environmental quality, because with horses you grow with the fuel, and so you dedicate part of the land not to row crops, but to others. And so you have this very circular event. So that gets lost by the end of the Second World War. In that we had a lot of really interesting writing. Henry A. Wallace, the editor of Wallace's Farmer. And if you look back on those writings, in that the family was very much involved with agriculture. And that after the Second World War, there's no longer any women's section, any children's section to the farm magazines. It's all business. And this is where you get that all-out production, get big or get out philosophy by the 1970s. But Wallace unwittingly started a lot of this with his hybrid seed corn. And so today, when you think of Pioneer, and the questions we have about that, came from sort of a well-meaning beginning in that. And the idea of corn. Iowa used to be where the tall corn grows. And now it's all hybrid, all genetically modified. What has that done? And we still use the phrase that we grow the food that feeds the world, yet the corn now does not feed anyone. It makes about 1,400 different additives and ethanol and all sorts of other things. So, and with the emphasis on corn, then we've lost our soil. And this is what was said at the end of the Second World War, is that losing our topsoil in Iowa. By conservative estimates, we've lost over half in 150 years, half our topsoil. And so what does that mean in the next 150 years? So corn is a part of that. And then we lose, too, the general farming, which is a very conservation-friendly type of farming, where you had so many animals and so many crops, and you had a real economic balance to it, but also an ecological balance to it. Now with the New Deal, now with subsidies, now with all-out production, you get the focus, the specialization. So you get the use of row crops, corn and soybeans, right? Corn and soybeans. It may sound like a good crop rotation, but what does that do to the pheasants? What does that do to the ducks? Let alone, the water and the soil quality in that. So anyway, so in 1928, to give a little bit about Hoover, it was great optimism. This is the train going out for his inaugural, and that this was a lot of the romance, of the farm, and this idea about being back to nature. Okay, we don't think of that with farming now. Now farming is business; it's a factory, right? We talked about that, so we lose all of those phrases and much of that romance that we brought in. And a lot of the turmoil. The second most violent place in the country was in Sioux City, Iowa, because of what farmers were losing in their way of life in that. And so this was going on too. So lots and lots of tension about all these changes. And yes, we did Photoshop before there was Photoshop. Corn was not really that big then. So go ahead. So. Anyway, this is a very austere photo from the 30s, but now people will say, coming back to Iowa, where are all the fences? And this is one thing. Not only have the houses disappeared, the barns have disappeared, the fences have disappeared. And with that, there goes some of the hunting, as well, because you would have those green spaces in that. And so this is the beginning. Iowans get the first agricultural adjustment check, and so that changes in 1938 because it's ruled unconstitutional. Now it has to go to more conservation efforts. Okay, so we talk about REAP programs and things like that. It can't be subsidies, but we tried to take a conservation turn. Anyway, so then this is the talk that we hear too, is where it talks about the stock market. This is going to change our money, but we'll see this in Iowa in the 1980s with the farm crisis and that as well. So again, you can see when you look at these older photos, there's the ducks, there's the geese, there's the birds, because you had more animals, so all of that gets created. And that Also, too, Iowa farms have been considered the best places for children. These farms were like parks in that. But we see a lot, too, of a reality about Iowa's farms, okay? That these really weren't the best places to raise children, and that the one-room country schoolhouse had problems with funding and access, and children with disabilities, and all sorts of other factors as well. And so we'll go through a couple more of these changes in that. And what you see too is a lot of the women being very, very active on the farms in the 1930s. It would be the egg money, the butter money that saved the farms in that. And so women would try to get much more participatory in the economics after the Second World War. So anyway, we'll go through just a couple more and then I'll be done. So finally, we could end with this one. That is my grandma on the left-hand side. That was my Aunt Daisy at the time. And though they'd grown up on a farm at that time, they would leave. My Aunt Daisy would go to Chicago for a better teacher's salary, and then my grandma, who's on the far left, and then after living on a dairy farm with 4 kids and no electricity, she vowed never to be on a farm. When she retired, they were not. That to her was not a good way to live. So I think of my Aunt Linda. She's not in the photo, but she would live to be 100. We were driving up to my dad's acreage. My dad had a park ranger, and she was not quite 100 yet. And she said, "Oh, I think it's probably a little better to live on the out in the country now, because you've got lights and you've got phones and that kind of thing." So much has changed. Anyway, so I'll end there. So that's some of the depth and the crest of that early Depression era, and then the New Deal era, and then World War II would forever change things. So, thank you.
What I'll do right now is just open the floor to the audience for questions or comments.
When you started putting this book together, how did you decide on who was going to write and the theme of it and how to tie it all together?
That's a really good question. I had an idea that there were certain areas that had to be covered, and I posted a number of calls for submissions for papers on blogs. Some of them turned out to be successful. I brought in some people that I have not even shaken their hand to this very day. And then I knew of people who were doing interesting work too. Over the years, I had met a number of people such as Lisa Ocean and Dennis Anderson and Bill Hoffman along the way, who were people who were able to write and had good ideas. And I found myself asking them to pursue their ideas. And in a certain way, the book could have been 700 pages had I had my druthers, but then it would be more expensive, and I'd probably still be working on the book, and the book would not be released yet. So I put out a general call, and at the same time I recruited heavily from talent that I knew was out there, and I think that's the way that it came together. And then, of course, some things just fell on me because I felt I had to speak to them, I had to write about them, because no one else submitted any essay or any other piece of writing that covered these topics. So I said, that must receive at least some coverage, and I'm also going to write about it in an original way. So I found myself contributing one essay. I could have easily contributed 2, but I wanted to make sure there was adequate room for brighter minds than mine.
I have a question, I think it's probably for Dennis.
Do you think there are fewer ducks and geese now than in 1988 or whatever you were in
Well,
school?
geese may be an exception.
Ducks, you think there are fewer ducks?
Yeah, you have geese can propagate in almost any circumstance that
Yeah.
you see around town. I'm sure. I sense your anger as a person.
No, my husband is a,
But ducks certainly,
I'm never,
the ducks are,
limited, but I think we ought to do something for fish, because I'm thinking we have ducks all over, it's ducks and geese. But
yeah, we don't have too many, we don't have as many anywhere near the ducks that we once had by far. In fact, Heron Lake, some of that history, I think that school building's still standing there actually. But anyway, back in the 30s, give or take, I'm doing that from recollection, but the kids in school could hear that, and that was called the Chesapeake of the Midwest, and that's where canvasbacks stopped en route south and back and north in the spring. And they could hear the wings of the canvasbacks in the school class before they could see the birds. They could hear the thunder of wings, and they would run to the windows and throw the windows open and wait and wait and wait, and minutes later they would see the bird. And some of it, obviously there is no, the watershed that feeds Heron Lake and similar around here. I mean, there's very little grade to it. By the time you do the ditching and so forth, it's almost unfixable. It's not going to come back that time.
But aren't they making a lot of improvements, like Marsh Lake? Anybody know about Marsh
That's
Lake?
new. Yeah, that's yet to be demonstrated. I mean, that's 10 years in the making. But they're making efforts, right? But it's kind of essentially, I mean, context is finger in the dam type of thing. Butterflies, I mean, you can go kind of go on and on of the species that have been lost or that are diminished. Having said that, the part of it's age too, and this is another fascinating question. Okay, kids coming up today see what is, and we saw what was, and part of the reference there as you age is that it's not the same, but a part of the reference also can be attributed to aging, in your perspective. So a young, my boys are 21 and 23, what they see and what they're experiencing in their world has been at sometimes abundance, and they'll remember that relative abundance. So it is a matter of perspective in some respects, but
I'd like to interject something because I appreciated note number 1, Tony's introduction, to help clarify plains and prairie. For purposes of this collection, plains and prairie have two definitions each, a vegetation definition and a regional definition. Prairie is grassland of one of three types: tall grass, mixed grass, and short grass. All three types consist of perennial grasses, forbs, and legumes. Prairie is also the large areas of American land used for agriculture now, but once in prairie vegetation. In the U.S., prairie tends to be more, but not exclusively, oriented to the areas that were tall grass at the time of the European encounter. Plains is the flat land in the middle of North America. The vast area stretches from the Mississippi to the Rockies. Additionally, plains can be narrower and mean the short grass and mixed grass prairie areas, and also land used for agriculture now, but once in short and mixed grass prairie vegetation. In the middle of North America, the plains also include the western tall grass prairie. Canadians, you expect they have a different view of things, refer to all their plains areas as prairie and avoid the use of the word plains. I didn't know that.
Well, if I could interject too, because I teach at a community college, so Walter Prescott Webb had talked about the 100th meridian, where the prairies turned to plains. Sounds all very complicated. But then I asked my students, okay, you're driving to Colorado, right, on I-80 in Nebraska. What happens when you cross, when you've crossed that 100th meridian? And I go, what happens about a third of the way through Nebraska? And then they go, oh yeah, it gets boring, it gets flat, it gets... like, that's where you're crossing over, and that's that. And so I thought Tony did a really nice job with, there's the prairie areas and then the plains, and sometimes we use those interchangeably, but it's not really so. They're two different kinds of landscapes. And yeah, in the 1870s, the phrase was, you know, the rain will follow the plow. And so people thought we could purposely change the climate, you know. And the plains had, every 30 years, a wet cycle, you know. And people thought, oh, it's going to be lovely. It's going to be like, you know, like the prairie. And it was for a short time.
They were right. We can change it.
We can change, I know. But they were all happy about it. There was all this promotional,
Sure.
you know, and so it's interesting with that. But I wanted to add on the birds. The birds are kind of, I don't mean to be superstitious, but they're signs of things. And there's a park that I grew up in. I've been there for 40 years. And so I do have that memory, you know. And there was one day about a month ago I came out there, and there were at least 100 seagulls and 2 bald eagles and 30 Canadian geese. And I've never in my life, and you're not supposed to see. I mean, a younger person would have gone, wow, look at this. You know? But I'm like, this isn't right. There's seagulls. I've never seen seagulls in Central Iowa. There was hundreds of them. And then 2 bald eagles, and then the Canadian, and it's just, there was just something, it looked very pretty, but it was bizarre. You know, knowing my memory, that's not how Central Iowa should be. And the birds, you know, are reflective of that. So, I don't know. Yeah, that's why conservation gets so complicated.
We have friends in Britain who visit, you know, somewhat regularly in the summer, and they, you know, windows are open so for the screens, and hearing the birds, you know, they just think it's stereophonic. It's so loud, and they can't believe it because the birds in Britain, not all birds, but the songbirds particularly are gone. You know, they just don't have it, and they don't hear them. And to them, it's literally music. You know, it's a wonderful thing.
I wanted to mention something about grassland ecosystems. This is from my chapter. What biodiversity loss means for the productivity of the native Midwestern grasslands is something Tillman, that's David Tillman, Regents Professor of Ecology at the U, and his colleagues have analyzed and calculated following long-term field experiments performed at Cedar Creek. And of course, Lindemann began all this in the 1940s. This is the most extensively studied ecosystem in the world, I would say, because it basically, ecosystem science started there. They found that decreases in grassland plant diversity affect productivity as much as changes in nitrogen, carbon dioxide, herbivores, water, drought, or fire. So diversity is key. In their natural state, the lakes of grass, as the Lakota described the prairie to the French explorer Joseph Nicolet, thrive as communities of grass plant relatives. And since this, the citation of this particular passage, that paper was published 3 or 4 years ago, just recently, Tillman and his colleagues and others have established that, I think fairly convincingly, that grassland plant diversity is hugely important as not only for ecosystems' health, but as a carbon sink. That is to say, it's surprising how a diverse grassland captures the CO2 from the atmosphere. It does it very effectively, and in fact, the upper Midwest, because of its vegetation generally, but certainly grassland is part of that, captures more CO2 and is, as reflected in gross primary productivity of both the photosynthesis, and scientists have shown that the upper Midwest grasslands are very effective at capturing CO2 and through photosynthesis. So it's something that, you know, there's great value in diverse grasslands beyond food production, etc.
So do you see hope for conservation in the eating local, farming local, the organic farming and things like that that seems to be more acceptable now?
Well, I think that's a great question because things are better now in many respects, notwithstanding that there are some things that are worse when you look at the climate now. But I can remember as a kid, maybe I hung around with the wrong people, but I remember people rolling down their window and throwing cans out the window. And that's just one example. So I think we've made tremendous progress. The question ultimately isn't quite framed that way. I think the pertinent question is, given world populations and increasing, given the effect on climate, and kind of this matrix of how we're going to feed people, how we're going to use the land, how we're going to conserve the water, and that there's a time element to accomplishing some of these. I don't think we can go indefinitely the way we are right now. That in that context, that question is most pertinent, is given the time frame of 25 years ahead or whatever it is, can we make the progress that we have in many respects made already, but on a much larger scale, if that makes any sense. But in the end, I'm optimistic because, I think most people, especially in Minnesota, but I think there's a lot of goodwill in Minnesota to do the right thing. But the political structure in Minnesota, as it is elsewhere and nationally and globally, is not necessarily conducive to the channeling of that goodwill to effective action. And, you see that all the time, obviously.
I guess more specifically on the local food movement, it encourages a diverse local landscape, which is very important, and I think that's something we want to preserve as well. A cultural landscape, in other words, a landscape that's been shaped by people bringing plants and keeping those plants growing, and also bringing animals and keeping varieties of those animals available. That's quite important. But in a sense, monoculture is very, very efficient, and there's a reason why monoculture has had such power. And so, in terms of a larger conservation picture, I think we have to ask, how much monoculture do we really want to support with our choices? Michael Pollan is famous for having said, the author, we vote 3 times a day for agricultural policy and environmental policy with each meal. And so, on the one hand, I think there will be large agriculture. There will be areas that will be huge and scaled up, and there will be areas where small farming predominates. It's just a question of what is the mix between each, because I don't think any of us in this room would really want to go back to local food in southwestern Minnesota, because that would be no fruits and vegetables for 8 months out of the year.
I'm going to contradict that.
Yeah.
So when I did my research on World War II, and so the fourth front I looked at, the first front was agriculture, but the fourth front was the kitchen front. And so during World War II, because we didn't have the transportation available, we had rationing and that. We had what were called victory gardens, but we had a tremendous amount of canning. So you have to have that. So therefore, you can have fruit year-round, okay? It's on the side. But we had a tremendous local food and, conservation and recycling effort and all that. We didn't call it those things, but we very much knew how to do that, valued that. We wanted that idea of taste, and economy and that pride and all of that. But we lost all of that because there was this big push from the all-out food production, and monoculture and all of that this is what we have to go to. And so the women in the 50s weren't pushed into the kitchen, they were told to get out of the kitchen. And the way to get out of the kitchen was with frozen foods and processed foods and things like that. And so it was a bizarre kind of mix. And we're also told, I'm working on a project about famine, okay? Now we're also given this line that we have to have monoculture and technology to feed the world. But what Herbert Hoover has been saying for over 100 years is not the amount of food, it's who's getting the food. How do we distribute it and what's wasted? It's all of the politics and economics and logistics of food. We have plenty of food, but we don't share it and we waste it, and that we don't need to go to, as the World Food Prize people will tell us in Iowa, to this kind of, that green revolution is the only, there's lots of ways we can feed, but we've got to value different things, And then my husband gets into the free market theory, then you get into that too. Well, you got to pay more and spend more time. You got to value our food more, And now we're prepared to do that as well. So it's very, very complicated. There's no easy routes to it. But we could do, and this is what people in the Depression era said, we could do all sorts of things, Iowa didn't have soup lines and that because they had canning efforts and they shared garden produce and they did all sorts of really creative local things, to feed each other and that. But they got lost along the way.
But there have been some high-profile pushbacks. When you look at the Storm Lake newspaper winning the Pulitzer Prize for taking on agribusiness. And I'm sure I heard a National Public Radio report of a lawsuit concerning nitrate runoff that was making some headway and waking some people up because of one thing about Lindemann's work, it does tie into the interference with natural cycles. These are huge deals, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and so on, and how we are altering these cycles in ways that there's no evidence in the geological record that some of this kind of dramatic change. That's tied in with ecosystems ecology very closely, and this is all related to. We've heard the term the Anthropocene, the International Commission on Stratigraphy, looking at changing the name of the geological era we're in from the Holocene, which has been here since the end of the last ice age, 11,700 years ago. Maybe our footprint is such now that human footprint that we should call it the Anthropocene, the human age. And I can say that I did share my chapter with some people on that, some members of that working group, international working group, and they who have an interest in the ecosystem aspect of all this, and they appreciated that. So.
I would add on the positive side as well, following up on your question, there are a lot of smart people who are working on stuff, and among them at the university. The University of Minnesota in this case, but their agronomy people essentially were the ones, there are others as well, who gave us corn and soybean. They're the ones who developed those crops and kind of where we're here. Now they've got really smart people working on not only alternatives, but kind of supplemental crops that keep something growing on the landscape all year round, perennials. Among the interesting one called Prenza, that you would keep it green forever, and you can grow your corn and everything, but it's green on the soil, and you can also harvest it. Another one is perennial sunflowers, where you're not going in every year and digging those things up and turning over the soil. So there's a lot of things are happening, and I think I wouldn't give up yet, that's for sure. Because there are smart people sitting around. You can argue about the current political situation nationally. Trump's trying to undo this and undo that. Generally speaking, people who talk, and I don't know much about all that in terms of reaction, the human reaction, but the human reaction to speech and action usually is countervailing speech and action. And so it's not necessarily, people don't, the human system doesn't work where you just keep going like this and then a bad guy comes and you go like this. Sometimes the bad guy, we can be calling him that in a moment, goes like this, and all these other people are thinking harder and faster and working more. And so you really don't know where things are going to end up, and that's why it's really important to be, positive. And think about opportunities, because opportunities inevitably, past this prologue, are out there.
Well, I would add too, it's a little easier to be positive in Minnesota. We're closing the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture in Iowa State. It's been in operation for 30-some years. And so the current leadership is, boom, line item, gone.
Who's that guy?
Yeah. And Governor Branstad is not going to counteract that. He's going off to China. So, so people are really upset. Like these have been efforts people have worked on for 30-some years, and just one line item, that funding is gone. They do not want any discussion about sustainable agriculture. And
That's too bad.
yeah. So anyway, I know I love living in Minnesota. So so sometimes things can get undone.
Well, are there any other questions?
Yeah, and on a positive.
Well, here's my third question. I had questions lined up for all of you. I'll just ask the third question of each of you. Who could benefit and how would they benefit from reading this book?
You're our leader.
Well, I think this should be available in the schools and community groups, libraries, of course. What's the most effective way of reaching the general public? But schools, this. First of all, I think all the chapters are well written and very accessible. It's non-technical language with lots of documentation, and there are stories in there. They're interesting stories. And it covers a lot. There's I wrote about a famous ecosystems ecologist, but it also involved history significantly, going back almost a century. Iowa. I found that fascinating. I grew up in Blue Earth, Minnesota, which is in Faribault County on the Iowa border, and everything that you wrote pertains to Faribault County, practically. So I found that to be most interesting. The situation with honeybees. We'll be learning more about the threat of certain chemical agents and pollination. How are we going to do without pollination? I'm not sure. Maybe you have an answer.
No, I don't.
These are major issues. One thing I can say for certain, though, that at least from my perspective, is that independent science has to weigh on all these things. Not science funded by interest groups, but independent science, and that means that the academic community is key. They may produce a report that some are wary of, they don't quite trust, but you have to go with the best science you have, even if the answer isn't quite what you wanted, and it cannot be swayed by interest groups on either side of this, whether it be NGOs or corporations or what have you. So academic science is absolutely critical in my view, especially if we move. I worked in the medical school, and things like the vaccine controversy really get me going. You've got it nailed down, but you don't. And we saw that with the outbreak of measles in the Twin Cities, particularly among unvaccinated Somali youth, and the efforts of anti-vaccine folks to come in and use this venue as a way of propagandizing, this community. It's just terrible. Peer-reviewed academic science is key.
In terms of people who read, I think that the important thing is that this is about land ultimately, and Leopold, his whole deal in the Sand County Almanac, probably many of you, most of you, all of you have read it, talk about developing a land ethic. And the danger that we have, of course, as we have Lisa took us through the history of what was, and good, bad, or indifferent, however tough the conditions were back in the family farm without electricity or whatever, but you did have a relationship with land and with animals, and you understood it in that context. Of course, we've moved away from that now, whatever it is, 3%, 5% of the people in Iowa now are connected to farms, and that's a different kind of farming than we had traditionally. So, you know, anything that can get in the hands of people and educate them, interest them, do anything really about land and thinking about land and the importance of land, and because ultimately we're land, and you know, it's inseparable. The health of the land is going to be telling of the health of the water, and the health of the water is going to be telling of our health. And once you make the connection, anything that you can do to help people learn about that, I think is positive. So,
And as an addendum to what Dennis said concerning Leopold's The Land Ethic, which is the concluding essay in his Ascent County Almanac, he laid out his environmental philosophy in the essay. A land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens, quote, from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it, unquote. The first principle of an ethic for the land was straightforward. Quote, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise.
I was going to say I grew up in a park in the 1970s, and what I learned there was just the diversity of people who love parks. And so you never knew, as my dad was a park ranger, you never knew who was going to show up at the door. You know, whether it was a picnicker or a sailboat or a snowmobile or a fisherman or those crazy hunters, you know, and they're just the crazies, you know. But they all had that kind of connection, you know, and it was that diversity of people who thought about and believed in conservation in one way or another. And so that's what's nice about this book, is there's such a variety of different essays in that. And that's really the way you have to think about conservation. There isn't any one idea or one person. You've got to have science, you've got to have some romance, you've got to have, you know, a little craziness as well.
In fact, the concluding essay in the book by Tony's father, Joe, gets to the heart of that.
Yeah.
That conservation in and of itself is a diversified view.
It has to be.
Well, I think on that note, thank you all for coming. Books are available for sale. The name of the book is Conservation on the Northern Plains. It also is on Amazon. So I'd appreciate if you would check it out. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.